All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're calling in from today. And welcome to the launch of the Mind the Gap 2 report and Closing the Gap 2 policy paper. My name is Lauren Gerken. I'm the INEE Gender Coordinator, and I'll be your moderator as we launch these exciting new resources today. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few quick housekeeping points. So for security reasons, your audio and video have been disabled, but you can still actively participate through the chat and the Q&A functions. And it's exciting to see people start to introduce themselves in the chat. You are welcome to submit questions in the Q&A at any time. Just click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to save some time towards the end of the webinar to address any questions you have. Closed captioning in English is available for this webinar, and you can turn it on by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this session is being recorded, and the recording and presentation slides will be shared on the INEE website and with all registrants by email. We highly encourage you to share the webinar recording, the report, the policy paper, and a few other resources we're going to talk about today with your colleagues. So let's get started. We have some great speakers for you today representing a range of organizations involved in the development of these resources. We'll hear from them on key findings, gaps, and recommendations from the report and policy paper, as well as insights into 3 of the programs highlighted as key studies in the report. Next slide, please. But before we dive into some of the report findings, I'd like to first hand over to Louise Holt, Director General for Social Development at Global Affairs Canada, and Dr. Heike Kuhn, Head of Division for Education at BMZ, for some opening remarks. Over to you, Louise.
Great. Thank you, Lauren, and good day, everybody. Very warm welcome on behalf of Canada. I'd like to start first by acknowledging that I am joining you today from what we call the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in Canada's National Capital Region, Ottawa-Gatineau, and express my sincere gratitude for the opportunity to work and live on this beautiful land of Canada's Indigenous peoples. As Lauren said, my name is Louise Holt. I'm the Director General at Global Affairs Canada, responsible for gender equality, education, sexual and gender-based violence, and child protection. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Heike Kuhn from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. I think, as many of you know, Germany is providing huge leadership in the education sector right now, not the least leading into the G7 in the coming days. So really pleased to be here with you, Heike, and sharing this. And I know from our other joint work how committed and dedicated you are personally to this issue. So on behalf of Dr. Kuhn and myself, we're really pleased to welcome you to the launch of the second INEE series of Mind the Gap report, Mind the Gap 2, Seeking Safe and Sustainable Solution for Girls' Education in Crisis. A huge thank you to the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, INEE, Education Development Trust, who are the authors of this report, and the Reference Group on Girls' Education and Emergencies for your continued leadership for girls' education. We have seen, particularly in recent years with COVID and global events, tireless efforts from all of you, from youth advocates, educators, implementing partners, civil society organizations, and education ministries, and making progress in the face of huge obstacles to ensure quality and inclusive education for all children and youth. But we know the work is not done. And as we go forward, I want to give a particular shout out to youth voices. Some of you may know that Canada recently held a Together for Learning Summit in March 2022, engaging youth and within our own Refugee Education Youth Council, as well as youth from around the globe, who launched a youth manifesto, really a manifesto drafted by and for youth, and setting out a vision for improving education of learners affected by crises, and really trying to center the voices of those most impacted by disruptions of global education. So much wisdom, so much insight, and knowing what is needed to advance efforts to ensure that those groups that they're representing do have access to education. And really looking forward to continuing to work with those amazing advocates as we go forward. As I said, Canada recognizes that there is still gaps in donor efforts to address barriers to education for children and youth, and particularly for girls in conflict and crisis affected countries. And we're certainly seeing in this report the need to address those gaps and to strengthen the evidence base for girls' education and emergencies in particular. That's why we are continuing to support INEE, and we're funding a new initiative that is actually focused on strengthening data and evidence to inform policy and practice. The new project builds on the work that we've already been doing with INEE, and that was supported originally through our G7, Canada's G7 Charlevoix Education Initiative, which did start the wheels turning for building the evidence and data. We saw that through the Charlevoix dashboard, which was also recently launched, and then again through this Mind the Gap. We really do feel that reports such as this one are so important in ensuring global efforts are actually targeting and addressing those barriers that are facing children most impacted and most vulnerable. And really by pulling these together, it really reinforces a collective movement, increases awareness, and particularly as we, for us, welcome the 4th year anniversary of the Charlevoix commitments to girls' education, but really pass the baton over to Germany, who I know is picking this up so strongly. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Gerken.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
A great honor. And I would just like to say at the beginning that the Mind the Gap 2 report is an excellent stock taking of where we stand and where we need to go. And thank you, Canada. The report monitors our G7 Charlevoix commitments for girls' education in crisis context. And since Charlevoix, girls' education kept to be an important topic for the G7. You have seen this, and I'm glad to share with you that this is also the case under this year's G7, German G7 presidency. You may have seen this in the wording in the text. Coming back to some of the things Louise had said. So I'm glad that she already mentioned it. Education is a human right, and this is a key to promote gender equality itself. And this year, as G7, we agreed to support inclusive and gender transformative education systems. I think this is key because all girls must have the opportunity to have access to school. And why? We need their brains. Louise, I'm really on the same page with you, with Canada, on the young people, on their voices. We have in our ministry created a youth advisory council, and this is so revealing and so good what young people say. So coming back to the report, as outlined in the report, girls living in crisis context are even more threatened to be excluded from education. And the report highlights 3 alarming facts. First, distance learning during the COVID-19 pandemic is often not designed to be gender sensitive or inclusive. Second, gender-based violence is on the rise, in particular in the school environment. And third, the impact of climate change contains girls' education directly and disproportionately. So all these barriers are rooted in harmful gender norms. Therefore, education is tasked with contributing to end the structural barriers and harmful gender norms, keeping girls out of school, keeping them out of school where they belong. And as you might know, Germany has decided to pursue a feminist development policy because sustainable development can only be achieved as girls have rights, resources, representation, and voices. And this is why our German Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, Svenja Schulze, has personally co-signed Education Cannot Wait's call to action to empower her, a report that highlights why we need girls' education in crisis settings. And on this year's International Day of Education, Germany has announced 200 million euro of multi-year funding for ECW, and reliable funding is really needed in this context. So, and also I wanted to mention that we are delighted to co-convene ECW's upcoming high-level financing conference next year, February 16 and 17th in Geneva, together with Switzerland, Norway, and partners from the Global South. Let me come to the end. This replenishment conference, but all the year long, will be an opportunity for us, for other donors, to invest into girls' education in crisis. Investing in education, especially for girls and children in conflict regions, is an investment in our common future. In order to achieve SDG 4, we need all to step up our efforts. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Louise and Heike, for those important remarks. As you said, it is particularly critical that we prioritize inclusive, quality education for girls in crisis and conflict, especially now in the wake of COVID-19 and increasing climate-related crises. Our hope is that this report and policy paper series represent a positive step towards a stronger evidence base for girls' education in emergencies and protracted crises. Next slide, please. So let's jump into some of the content. So Mind the Gap 2 and Closing the Gap 2 are the second edition of a report and policy paper series developed in support of the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Education's commitment to enhance the evidence base and monitor progress towards gender equitable education in crisis and conflict. They were developed in collaboration with the INEE Reference Group on Girls' Education in Emergencies and the INEE Gender Task Team, and graciously supported by Global Affairs Canada. Mind the Gap 2 summarizes progress, gaps, challenges, and opportunities in improving education and training for women and girls affected by crisis and conflict. It monitors progress since the first edition of the Mind the Gap report and highlights 3 thematic areas prioritized by the reference group: distance education and the digital divide, school-related gender-based violence, and girls' education and climate crisis. The report is accompanied by the Closing the Gap 2 policy paper, which summarizes key findings from the report and recommends actions for a range of stakeholders to address the gaps identified in the delivery, planning, funding, and monitoring of girls' education in crisis and conflict. Next slide, please. Recognizing that our readership is made up of busy humanitarians, we've also developed some summary briefs. These briefs provide concise overviews of key findings, gaps, and recommendations on the 3 highlighted thematic areas. And we've also developed an infographic of key statistics from the Mind the Gap 2 report, which we hope can be a useful tool for advocacy and awareness raising. And I'll drop the links to all of those resources in the chat in just a moment. Next slide, please. So I'll hand over now to Ruth Naylor, Lead Advisor for Girls' Education for Education Development Trust and lead author for Mind the Gap 2 and Closing the Gap 2. Ruth and her team will share some key findings and remaining gaps from the report. Next slide, please. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And yes, as Lauren said, it's an update, it's a monitoring report saying where have we got in policy, data and financing since the report launched last year, Mind the Gap 1, and with a deep dive into 3 themes. And it presents the most recent data, so it leaves me to say what it doesn't include. The data are mainly 2019, 2020, so we're not yet seeing data of the impact on of COVID-19 on girls' education in crises. It is on the 44 countries that we looked at in the first report, but 2 events in those countries that are not covered. The events in Afghanistan were considered too sensitive to cover, and the events in in the Ukraine actually happened after the writing, so that they're absent from the report. Next slide, please. So what is the progress? A highlight is the improvements in data, huge improvements on completion rates and learning outcomes. Now, because we didn't have very good data in the first Mind the Gap report, we can't say for sure what the overall improvements have been, but there are good positive signs of improvement in enrolment and gender gaps closing. But that is up to the point of the COVID-19 pandemic. So good progress was going on before then. We don't know the story. We don't know the full picture post COVID-19. But the really big change is the global awareness of the importance of ensuring all girls, especially those affected by crises, should be able to complete 12 years of a safe, quality education. And G7 has been vital in that. And it's great to hear that Germany is going to continue championing it this year. There have been campaigns, new funding mechanisms, and investment commitments, very importantly, investment commitments by donors and by the national governments to support education and sometimes explicit focus on girls. Next slide, please. But we still do have some big gaps. There are still massive gaps in access, with less than half of girls completing secondary, lower secondary in crisis affected countries, and some countries much lower, less than 10%. We don't yet know the full impact of COVID-19, but there's strong evidence that it will be gendered and worse for girls affected by crisis. And in 2021, there seemed to be a real lack of responses to get girls to return to school. National funding, the spending is still far below the commitments. And there was a worrying trend in a lot of crisis-affected countries that it was low and had been falling over the 4 years prior to the COVID crisis. And we might see financial implications of the COVID crisis as well. And in humanitarian aid, the positive story is that it's gone up in priority in terms of appeals. It's being much more money is being asked for education, much higher level, but it's gone down relative to the demand. The funding is not meeting that demand. It's not kept up. It's still only 3% of humanitarian funding. Now I'll hand over to Ella to take us through some of the topics.
Thank you, Ruth. So, as we've heard, distance education and the digital divide was one of the thematic areas for this year's Mind the Gap report. The COVID-19 has really heightened attention to mechanisms for delivering education when children do not have physical access to a school building. And there's a somewhat limited but fast developing evidence base around girls' use of technology and education technology itself. Current research tends to be from quite a limited number of contexts, and there remain some questions about the transferability of findings and effectiveness of EdTech more generally. So at the height of the pandemic, 1.5 billion learners out of school, schools closed in 190 countries. UNICEF estimated that globally 222 million girls couldn't be reached with digital or broadcast education. So girls really face a range of gendered barriers to the use of education technology, all of which are really, all of which are highly contextual. So although the data shows that gender gaps in access to technology are continuing to decrease, girls and women lag behind men and boys in their access to internet and devices, including mobile phones, as well as in their digital skills and competencies. The largest gaps remain in the least developed countries, where just 19% of women use the mobile internet compared to 31% of men. And then within the household, girls face a number of contextual barriers based around social norms to using the available technology for learning. So domestic and caring responsibilities have been shown to limit the time girls have available for learning during school closures. And girls reported that it was challenging to create a routine where they had uninterrupted study time and a safe place to study. We also saw that girls' access to technology is often mediated by parents. So some research during COVID showed that in some contexts, parents privileged boys' access and use of technology, and concerns around mobility and safety limited girls' access to community spaces. Despite these gaps and challenges, the immediate measures adopted as COVID-19 response by most national governments tended to be reliant on access to technology. So it's really clear that we need to know more about girls' digital lives, particularly for girls in crisis-affected contexts. As you can see on the slide, research has shown that many girls experience violence online. 58% of girls in this survey reported that they'd experienced online harassment or abuse. So technology clearly presents new safeguarding risks, but it's important to remember that it can also open a new channel for reporting and support. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. So in the report, we identified some promising practices when it comes to what can be effective and make distance education work for girls in crisis-affected contexts. So we looked at a range of no-tech, some tech and high-tech programs, which each work to reach girls with learning in a different way. Low-tech approaches tended to build on existing community structures, positions and spaces to provide access to learning materials, in some cases teaching or tutoring, and a way of signposting to other services. Some tech approaches used appropriate technology to supplement learning and increase contact between students and teachers. For example, using WhatsApp for Q&A or phone calls to provide support in the use of paper-based learning materials. And higher tech approaches might adapt or make it possible to use a higher tech device, perhaps by providing preloaded content. So all of these promising practices that we explore in the report are based on a really detailed understanding of what tech girls have access to, how they have access to it, and what barriers they are likely to face. Providing safe spaces for learning within the community, it can then support access and maintain an in-person contact with girls and their families, which is really shown to be important both for well-being and for supporting girls to return to school. So if we move on to the next slide, we can talk about the next thematic chapter on school-related gender-based violence. So in the first Mind the Gap report, we highlighted that it's safer for a girl to be in school, but the available studies showed a high prevalence of violence against girls in and around school in crisis-affected contexts. So in this year's report, we took a more in-depth look at the data available and the programme and policy responses to gender-based violence in schools. So a stronger picture of what violence adolescent girls are experiencing can be developed by combining existing surveys. Some of the surveys that are available are shown here on the slide. Each has a slightly different methodology, different coverage, and asks about slightly different things. For example, while most surveys give some data on the experience of bullying and fighting at school, there's much more limited data available on teacher violence, sexual harassment, sexual violence. And methods also vary. They range from representative household surveys to smaller school-based samples using self-administered questionnaires. The majority of the 44 countries covered in this report have at least 3 of these data sources available, and actions are underway to increase the quality, availability, and reporting of data around SRGBV. For example, the expansion of VACs under the leadership of Together for Girls and planned VAC surveys in humanitarian settings. We can see from available research which does combine some of these data sources, just how high the level of violence experienced by girls is. So this analysis, which combined DHS and VACs, found that 29% of adolescent girls reported experiencing physical or sexual violence, and quite shockingly, 17% reported having experienced sexual violence within the last 12 months. We can move to the next slide, please. Thanks. So effective strategies to tackle SRGBV identified in the report work at multiple levels in the system, community and school to tackle the social norms behind violence, change behaviour and improve reporting. It's important that SRGBV is integrated into national education policies. High-level policy commitments such as the Safe to Learn Call for Action and World Day to End Sexual Violence Against Children and Adolescents has raised some awareness of SRGBV, as has national legislation, but there's limited evidence around the implementation and impact of these commitments. Challenges and barriers to implementation identified include a lack of resources, lack of specialised personnel, challenges in coordination between different actors, and a general resistance to gender equality efforts. Some available research notes that these challenges to implementation remain, for example, amongst middle-tier education professionals, even where small-scale interventions in their context have been seen to make a real difference in girls' lives. In terms of programming, one of the approaches we highlight is the whole school approach, which is an example of a promising approach that works with a range of actors to change attitudes, behaviours and practices towards reducing violence. So it includes things like engaging with school leaders and the community, improving incident reporting, and making sure that there is a safe and secure physical environment in and around school. While this approach has been widely embraced, there doesn't seem to be a lot of strong evidence of impact. Evaluations in Uganda and Zimbabwe show that there's some promising impacts on increasing awareness of different kinds of violence and reporting. So really, there's a lot more for us to learn about what effective implementation of policy and programmes to challenge and reduce SRGBV really looks like. We really need more data on violence in and around schools, along with more use of impact evaluation to learn about effective policy and programme implementation, particularly around legislation and scaling up promising approaches. So that's it from me. I'll hand over to my colleague Kate, who will take us through the next chapter of the report.
Thank you, Ella, and hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So the last thematic chapter within the report focuses on girls' educations and emergencies and the climate crisis. Now, education, gender and climate change is an emerging area, although it's receiving increasing political interest and commentary, and rightly attracting more recognition that the education sector cannot ignore the effects of the climate crisis on learning outcomes, especially within the context of the existing learning crisis that's been exacerbated by COVID. However, this has resulted in a number of gaps, including between policy discourse and practice. Research and data on the intersections between the effects of climate change, gender and education is limited, although it's growing. For example, there are fundamental data gaps on the causality between the effects of climate change, manifested in part through extreme weather and forced displacement. Within this, data that disaggregates by sex and age are even more sparse. There's also limited research on the potential of education in addressing the causes of climate change, including through supporting sustainable behaviour change. Next slide, please. So the research highlights that vulnerability and exposure to the risks of climate change are driven by existing societal inequalities. For example, poverty, socioeconomic status, disability, age, gender, and level of education, meaning that these determinants, amongst others, are also key in influencing how individuals experience the effects of climate change, which can also amplify existing inequalities and risks to all children and their education, including conflict and factors that contribute to displacement. In 2020, for example, it was estimated that 30 million people were newly displaced due to extreme weather. And for those people that are living in informal settlements or tented communities, the effects of extreme weather can be particularly disruptive to their lives and also therefore their education. Next slide, please. So when we look to the direct and indirect effects of climate change and extreme weather on girls' education, they can be broadly categorized into risks and impacts on girls' access to education, on their learning outcomes and dropout. As an example, the direct effects of heat and drought to girls' access to education include damage to infrastructure and school buildings, for example, caused by wildfire. However, as this slide shows, there are many more indirect effects that have potentially longer lasting consequences. For example, limited access to wash or reduced learning capacity caused by poor nutrition as a result of bad harvests and heat. There also may be less time available to study because of women and girls having to travel further to collect water. And of course, these effects will have consequences for both girls and boys. However, as I noted earlier, it's those existing societal inequalities that enhance the risk for girls. Next slide, please. Thank you. However, there is real considerable opportunity for educated women and girls to become agents of change in the face of the climate crisis. So the evidence highlights that education, especially when girls complete secondary education, that it plays an important role in developing individuals' adaptive capacity, and it therefore reduces the negative effects of weather-related disasters and climate change. This is because it reduces the vulnerability of individuals and their communities, including through promoting gender equality. In addition, it's expected that building girls' green skills through STEM education will enable the transition to a green and low carbon economy and support the diversification of the sector. And lastly, relating to Louise's point on youth voice and youth empowerment, there's emerging evidence on the environmental benefits of transformative education for girls that develops their leadership skills, empowers political and civil society participation and engagement. However, and our final note is that in these discussions, it's important to remember that climate change is a global issue that requires all countries, especially those with high incomes that tend to emit higher carbon emissions, to take urgent action. Thank you very much, and back to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Ruth, Ella, and Kate for that comprehensive overview of the report findings. It's exciting to see that we have made some progress, even if we do still have a very long way to go before all girls have access to safe, quality education. Next slide, please. I'll hand over now to my colleague, Sumbul Bashir, INEE gender consultant, for some recommendations from the Closing the Gap 2 policy paper. Over to you, Sumbul. And next slide, please.
Thank you, Lauren, and hello to everyone who has joined us. As Lauren mentioned earlier, the Closing the Gap 2 policy paper presents several recommendations for key stakeholders within the education in emergencies ecosystem for working together to deliver safe and sustainable solutions for girls' education in crises. I will be presenting some of these here, but we highly recommend you to check out the policy paper for a more comprehensive list of recommendations and to check out the summary briefs for a set of recommendations by thematic focus, including climate change, distance education, and school-related gender-based violence. Next slide, please. Moving on to the recommendations. The report calls on policymakers in crisis-affected countries to integrate gender analysis at all stages of the planning, programming, and delivery of education crisis responses, and to coordinate across sectors and with partners to ensure girls' learning, protection, and well-being during crises. As Ruth previously pointed out, the Mind the Gap 2 highlighted that many of the national governments are still not meeting their international commitments for domestic spending on education. And so the paper calls on these governments to allocate at least 20% of their budget to education to meet the current gaps in education financing. For bilateral and multilateral donors, the report highlights the need to support the national governments in crisis-affected countries, gaps delivery of gender-responsive education. More particularly, it urges donors to increase humanitarian support to education, especially for multilateral funding mechanisms which have a strong focus on girls' education, such as Education Cannot Wait and Global Partnership for Education, and for local and grassroots level youth and feminist organizations. As for the civil society stakeholders, it calls on the global networks such as INEE itself to bring together stakeholders to synergize efforts for driving gender equality in education. Moreover, it urges civil society members in donor countries to continue the efforts to hold donor governments accountable to meet their commitments for girls and women education. Next slide, please. For collectors and collators of data, the key recommendation is to continue and strengthen the efforts for data collection and monitoring so we can have a whole picture of how gender and other vulnerabilities affect education and learning in crisis contexts. On a related note, the funders of research need to invest in rigorous empirical studies and impact analysis for gender-responsive delivery of programs, policies, and approaches on distance education, SRGBV prevention, and on the impact of climate change on girls' education. And lastly, teachers and educational personnel should be supported and trained so they can continue engaging with and working with students, parents, and caregivers to respond to the gendered barriers and challenges girls face in their access to education and learning. So these were some of the key points from the policy paper, but please check out the policy paper itself and the briefs for further details on how these recommendations can be materialized. Thank you for listening, and now I pass it back to Lauren.
Thanks so much, Sombal. That was really great. Next slide, please. We'll move now into presentations from 3 of the organizations whose programs are featured in case studies in the Mind the Gap 2 report. I'm very excited to introduce now Aries Tizon, Monitoring and Evaluation Officer for Plan International, who will be sharing some of the findings from the RASE Above program in the Philippines. Over to you, Aries.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening from the Philippines. Today I'm going to share with you our experience on the RASE Above Project's community learning kiosks in the Philippines. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Plan International Philippines implemented the Real Assets through Improved Skills and Education, or the RASE Above project, from 2019 to 2021. It is funded by UAE Aid and Dubai Cares through Plan Canada. It aimed to realize rights to quality education and skills for work and life among adolescent girls, young women, and young men in West Samar, Philippines. One of the biggest disruptions brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic was on the education of children and young people. When schools closed temporarily and students were asked to do distance learning, many challenges surfaced. Distance learning meant that classes or lessons could be conducted online, through radio or TV, or by manual delivery of learning modules. In Western Samar, not everyone has constant access to smartphones, computers, internet, and electricity, so the primary distance learning mode was through modular distance learning. Kids would be provided self-instructional modules that they can use at home, but it was not easy to adapt to this setting. Teachers from our partner schools shared that there were instances where students were not able to retrieve their modules or did not submit them. Some have trouble understanding the lessons, some don't accomplish the assignments and quizzes. There are also those who don't have access to a place that's conducive for studying. There are also those without adequate adult or peer support. It was difficult for teachers to really monitor their learning progress. Next slide, please. These challenges were noticed by Tenten, a youth leader in one of our partner communities. She then spoke to teachers, community officials, parents, the RASE Above project team, and the learners themselves. These discussions paved the way for the establishment of a safe space for students called the Learning Kiosks. Learning kiosks are meant to serve as safe spaces for those who need help with their studies, where they can access tutorial support and learning resources like textbooks, storybooks, educational games, learning devices. Learning kiosks also aim to help with the distribution of learning modules among communities. Having such spaces can also help teachers safely get in touch and communicate with their learners and provide the support they need. The RASE Above project provided literacy and numeracy trainings for teachers and community volunteers to equip them with the skills and knowledge to support the functioning of these. RASE Above project also provided basic school supplies and teaching learning materials. Meanwhile, local government units and community partners provided the spaces to be used as learning kiosks and allocated a budget to replenish the learning materials. Through Tenten's leadership, more youth volunteers were also mobilized to conduct learning sessions through peer-to-peer tutorial. College student volunteers were tapped to provide tutorial sessions on various subjects for younger learners. We wanted to replicate the successes of the kiosk, so the RASE Above project developed and designed a brochure to be distributed to partner municipalities, sharing detailed guidelines on how to establish and manage the learning kiosks. Anybody who wished to start learning kiosks in their own communities can do so with the help from this easy-to-comprehend, step-by-step guide. And through this guidebook, an additional 37 learning kiosks were established and replicated. Next slide, please. The Learning Kiosk was more than just a simple place to study. It was also a safe space. The Race Above project found that isolation and quarantine policies increased domestic and gender-based violence and early pregnancies. Girls and young women were also forced to sacrifice schooling just to do unpaid housework. The kiosk offered support against bullying, exploitation, and abuse. Youth leaders have also been able to speak up to local officials about the experience of girls during lockdown, including the negative impact on mental health and well-being. Learning materials on adolescent sexual and reproductive health and the prevention of gender-based violence were also made available in the kiosk as provided by Plan International. The INEE Mind the Gap report provided a platform for us, Plan International, the implementers, the policymakers, and donors to showcase success stories and best practices on gender-responsive education in emergencies and crises. Through these venues, we can learn and replicate innovations and strategies that have been proven effective in addressing challenges and issues faced by women and girls on education, especially during crises and emergencies. Thank you, everyone. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks so much, Aries. It's always so fascinating to hear about this innovative youth-led initiative and how it's really enabling learners who otherwise would have been left out of traditional distance learning program to be able to continue to learn in a safe and comfortable space. So thank you so much for sharing about this program. Next slide, please. We'll hand over now to our second case study presenter, Nancy Del Cole, Education's Technical Specialist at World Vision International, who will be sharing about her case study on healing and harmony, supporting girls who've experienced violence in DRC. Over to you, Nancy.
Thank you, Lauren, and greetings, everyone. If we can go to the first slide, please. I'm going to be talking about this project, Equality for Girls' Access to Learning, or EGAL, which is funded by Global Affairs Canada and implemented by World Vision and our partner Make Music Matter in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And specifically this intervention in EGAL, Healing and Harmony, which was developed by Make Music Matter. The Healing and Harmony is a therapeutic music program which addresses mental health and psychosocial stress amongst traumatized populations. In this specific case, we're looking at stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma-related behaviors in children, particularly girls who've been displaced by conflict in the DRC. Next slide, please. These two maps show you where we are operating. The left map shows you the province. It's Kasai Central in DRC. It borders on Angola. During the conflicts a few years ago, many of the families actually left DRC and went into Angola and have now returned. So they've been displaced twice, some of these children. And we're working in two communities. The arrows aren't quite lined up there, but one is Kananga and the other is Shimbulu. Kananga is a peri-urban location and Shimbulu is a very remote rural location, hard to access and difficult for Make Music Matter to get to, but they were able to actually set up a recording studio there. This area has experienced a lot of conflict. Between 2016 and 2018, about 1.4 million people were displaced and another 2 million people required aid. There were 150,000 children who lost access to schooling. And many of those families who were displaced have returned. So it's put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure, even though things are more peaceful now. Next slide, please. So the project reach is 600,000 total beneficiaries, and the ultimate goal is to improve learning outcomes for vulnerable children, especially girls in conflict-affected communities. And through Healing and Harmony, we're trying to see the link between addressing mental health issues related to trauma and return to school or re-enrollment in school. So that's one of the specific things we are researching through a research project in EGAL. And you can see the numbers there that the Healing and Harmony project is going to be addressing. We have 5 cohorts of the program, reaching at least 2,500 girls or more, about 500 boys, and 100 or more adult caregivers of those children. And I'll talk a bit about the project program, what it looks like, but it ends up in a culminating concert. So we had had intended to do 15 concerts, but COVID has made that less possible. So we've actually been consolidating some of those concerts. We've held 2 so far, and they've been a huge success in the communities. And next slide, please. So the Healing and Harmony model, as I mentioned, addresses psychosocial barriers to education. The hypothesis is that we can improve re-enrollment or enrollment, retention, and learning outcomes for children who've been out of school and have been affected by trauma. So these, first of all, these children are pre-tested by 2 screening tools. One is the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, and the other one is the Johns Hopkins Symptoms Checklist. And they are tested for stress, anxiety, depression, and trauma-related behavior. They're tested before the program, and they're tested after the program ends, after 3 months, to see if there's any change in those areas. And they are engaged in a psychosocial therapeutic model that uses cognitive behavior therapy and group therapy by a trained and certified therapist and a music producer working in tandem. These are locally hired people who work with the children in the program. We call them artists once they become participants. And they are using songwriting as a way to concretize an expression of their trauma. Once they've written these songs, they are professionally mixed and mastered by Make Music Matter, by a group of volunteers globally. And then that music is disseminated locally, mainly through community concerts where the children perform, but also on local radio, and if legally possible, according to music licensing laws, on streaming platforms as well. Because they are creating a tangible music product, this allows the artists to make meaning of their trauma. And many of them are expressing things they've never been able to speak about before. Some of the parents have said that children who were not speaking are now actually speaking as a result of being involved in this program. And once they've completed it, they become advocates in their communities, speaking out against different stereotypes, stigmas, shames, gender norms, and negative gender norms, gender-based violence, access to education, whatever they feel are the issues in their communities. And once the program is ended, they have the tools and the resilience to guide their own healing and determine a treatment pathway months after the program ends. Next slide, please. So this will just show you the numbers that we've been including in the first and second cohorts of Healing and Harmony. The third cohort is just completing now, and there are 2 more happening in this last year of the project. So you'll see the ratios of girls and women to boys and men. It's been a little tougher to attract boys and men to the program, but after the community concerts, we've seen an increase in interest from boys and men. And the pre-test and post-test scores here are for adult participants in one community in cycle 1. So you can see in the red percentages show very high levels of trauma-related behavior, depression, and anxiety. And you can see the reduction in those numbers at the end of the program, which has been quite dramatic. We've also seen these same numbers in children who test between 90 and 100% positive for depression, anxiety, and stress. And we've seen 30 to 60% reductions in the post-tests for the children in particular. Next slide, please. These pictures show you some of the participants or artists in the program in Kananga and Shimbulu. And you can see that the recording studios are very simple. They have high quality but simple equipment, which Make Music Matter sets up and which the children are using to record their music. And I just wanted to read one report from a young woman who's a young mother. And this is what she had to say after she finished participating in Healing and Harmony. I realized that I was not responsible for what had happened to me. My thoughts about my life, my environment, and my future changed. I relieved myself by sharing my story, and also I feel good about my body, to the point that I continue doing relaxation exercises at home and feel connected to the child I thought I would never love because the child reminded me of what I went through. So after the program, many participants or artists and their families are saying the children are interested in returning to school. At that point, we identify other access barriers such as payment of school fees, which is significant in these communities. And we are looking at other opportunities for helping out these families, like setting up savings and loans associations that are school-based and run by the parents so they can address school fees in particular. So thank you for listening. Happy to answer any questions you have about the program.
Thank you so much, Nancy. This is such an important initiative, helping survivors process trauma in an engaging and creative manner through art and really becoming advocates against gender-based violence. So thank you so much for sharing. Next slide, please. Our final case study presenter is the incomparable Ellen Chigwanda, Advocacy Advisor for Education for Care. Ellen will be sharing on the 5th case study in this report, particularly on girl-led action for climate change in Zimbabwe. Over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone from Harare, Zimbabwe. As CARE, we are very excited to be part of this conversation. And we're also very excited to have contributed to these new resources that INEE is launching, the Mind the Gap 2, as well as the policy paper. As CARE, we've facilitated the implementation of integrated climate change and education initiatives in Mali, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. And these initiatives have combined adolescent-led action on areas of concern identified by girls, school-based teacher training, as well as adolescent and community-based financial empowerment. And in all of those countries, these initiatives were targeted at rural communities that are severely affected by climate change, including multi-year droughts, which have affected livelihoods. And that, in addition to the traditional gender norms that contribute to disproportionately affecting girls as far as their education is concerned. And so today, as Lauren has said, I'm going to be talking just a little bit about the work that we've done in Zimbabwe. And this project, entitled Building Climate Resilient Schools, was implemented in Zimbabwe, in one of the very arid regions of Zimbabwe, which is CHIVI district, and it was implemented between 2018 and 2020. Next slide, please. So this slide just provides an overview, just as an overview for you to get an idea of what were some of the components that were included in the intervention. So first of all, when you look at the blue component, which was focusing on a whole school approach, I think another speaker earlier on was also talking about this whole school approach, essentially having a wide range of actors contributing to really thinking about this model that can help to build schools that are, thinking about climate change and taking into account the climate factor into education initiatives. So as part of that, it included both school level as well as community level participation around multi-hazard mapping, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, contingency planning, and really identifying what are those climatic issues, extreme weather events that are experienced in this district that have an impact on education more broadly, but also on girls' education. Secondly, focusing on climate smart or green technologies, which are gender transformative. So for CHIVI district, one of the major issues is water, and water itself was actually identified in some of the work that we have been implementing in this district as CARE as a big factor for attendance for girls. And so as part of this project, we were able to support the school to convert a manual water pump into a solar-powered, very high-yielding solar power water facility, as well as to provide 30,000 liter water storage, which would ensure that the school can have continued access to water throughout the year, as well as, of course, issues around labor-saving technologies, because before this project, water was only available outside of the school and not actually within the school grounds. And so this water facility was able to actually bring in piped water into the school grounds, which enabled girls and boys to access water easily. And then thirdly, we also included some innovative project-based, climate education and learning components, which includes an aquaponics feature this is integrated fish and plant technology, as well as a vegetable or nutrition garden, which contributed to some income generation for the school itself. And then lastly, opportunities for developing skills for resilience. So as care leadership development is a core part of our education and adolescent empowerment programming. And so that those leadership skills were a big part of ensuring that girls were located at the center, not only of the implementation of this project, but actually the designing, the planning, the implementation, and also to an extent, thinking about whether this project has been helping them to address, some of those challenges that I talked about in the beginning. Next slide, please. And so I, decided to share a pictorial which would help to just give you an idea of what this project looks like. So when you look at the first picture, it's showing you the manual pump, which has now been converted into a solar-powered water facility. So really providing, labor-saving green technology, which is accessed by, both girls and boys, as well as the teachers and the community within this village. And in the second picture, if I take the top row, you'll find that we have the 3 by 10,000 liter storage capacity for water. As I said, this enables the school. One of the challenges that they were facing was that in the dry season, it was very difficult for the school to have access to water, which was not only affecting girls in terms of menstrual hygiene, but it was also affecting attendance. It was affecting teacher retention, because many teachers were actually requesting transfers because of the challenges of water. So now they have 30,000 liters storage, and they essentially are able to access water throughout the whole year. And then the last picture on the top row is showing the aquaponics feature, which shows the fish ponds where the school is actually able to implement a fish project, which not only contributes to income for the school, but also contributes to the school feeding program, which is implemented in collaboration with the government of Zimbabwe. And then in the bottom row, those last 3 pictures are essentially showing the extent to which girls are involved in the project. They are able to really take stakeholders and influencers through the project, explain how the project works. They are the ones who are responsible for switching on the water facility and switching it off when it's not needed. And now they have access to water taps, which helps them to, access water for drinking, for menstrual hygiene, and just ensuring that they can have a more girl-friendly environment within the school. Next slide, please. And this project contributed, let me emphasize that this was a smaller project which was layered over and above a much bigger adolescent girls education as part of the FCD or funded girls education challenge projects. And so the implementation of this project also helped to achieve some of the results that I'm showing now. For example, the pass rates, which improved from 22% in 2017 before this pilot was implemented to 60% in 2018. When you look at teacher retention, there was also a jump in terms of the number of teachers who were requesting transfers. This project has been able to support the government-led school feeding program, which is feeding 625 learners, 50% of whom are girls. And then, of course, in generating income for the school. Menstrual hygiene for girls has been improved, and providing employment and dignity for parents who have offered their labor as part of offsetting some of their school fees. So the pilot itself was able not only to provide green technologies, but it was also able to help girls to develop skills for resilience, work with the community to understand why water management is important, resolve conflicts around water, but also to actively use their leadership skills to participate in a project that enables them to think about climate, not only as a science subject, but as something that is relevant to their daily life and also important for their educational outcomes. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's so exciting to see how schools and learning opportunities can be holistically adapted to be more climate resilient and more girl friendly, and to better prepare for girls for the reality of climate change. So thank you so much for sharing about this important intervention. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we are unfortunately at time. So we won't have time for the Q&A section, but I wanted to give a wholehearted thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers and to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the Mind the Gap 2 report and Closing the Gap 2 policy paper and trends in girls' education and emergencies and protected crises. Please do check out the resources on our website, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me at girlseducation@inee.org. Thanks again, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.